I tend to hear from designers primarily, right? The design community, that they can't get product when they need it. And, honestly, I haven't seen, other than a handful of projects a year, that actually deliver on the predicated contract time that we have to deliver it. And you've only got a finite amount of production time available at a plant, right? No one is producing spaghetti at their plant the way the industry is set up. That's what the intent is. And everyone does their what if scenario, and they talk about their potential volume predicated on at least 2 shifts of continued production.
This is the Mass Timber Group Show. I'm Brady, and today I caught up with Jean-Marc Dubois, the Director of Business Development at Nordic Structures. Jean-Marc has spent his career working to provide sustainable building solutions, and Nordic is the largest privately held engineered wood product manufacturer with the first commercial CLT plant in North America. To date, they've completed over 3,000 projects. We peeled back several conversation topics surrounding mass timber in this podcast, including commoditization, questions around capacity, and where the industry should be focused moving forward. If you like these podcasts, subscribing to the channel is the biggest compliment you can give us. So with that, let's get into it. There's a lot of talk in the industry about we either need to go to a more commoditized CLT route, or people advocate for focusing on these custom projects. Like, what's your take on that conversation?
I think there's 2 ways to view commoditization, right? The idea of utilizing consistent and uniform design and delivering consistent and uniform product to market is a large part of the potential for mass timber. That being said, you cannot necessarily expect every manufacturer to fit within one framework. There's a number of distinctions that happen in mass timber. First of all, speciation. Not every raw material in every market is mutable to from one market to another, right? So design properties are distinct. Doug fir and spruce, or our black spruce, tend to be very close in performance. And so you can get design values that are similar with a spruce glulam, for instance, a 24F glulam to a Doug fir glulam. And then you'll have similar proximity within the species, southern yellow pine or others, right? So that in and of itself, I think, allows for a certain amount of commoditization, but the difference between maybe southern spruce or southern yellow pine and Doug fir, regular SPF, tend to create distinctions, right? So you can't just have one size fits all. Manufacturing of raw material based on dimension lumber, that's great if that's the only source you're doing or the only source that you're utilizing, but it does create a dynamic where you're not necessarily able to extract the best value of the product predicated on the material that you're harvesting. And I think it forces everyone downstream into, when you do commoditize, it reduces your ability to extract value. For instance, if it makes sense for me to saw 2x5, for instance, which is not a commodity product and it's not available in the open market, and I don't, because I have to be the same dimensionality as all the other manufacturers, I'm limiting myself, and it's not good for the resources. I think it's a waste of resource. So every manufacturer who's vertically integrated, like Nordic, and I think that's a distinction that we have, because we are sawing our own raw material. We can actually optimize our product, and we can make better use of the resource. So commoditization in and of itself, while it's not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think it's really appropriate based on the multiplicity of species, the broad swath of geography that we have, different growing conditions, climates, and ecosystems that we have. A boreal forest and a temperate rainforest like we have out west, or a southern yellow pine, will generate completely different types of growth patterns. And commoditization, I think, is not possible if you're going to be respectful of the value of that raw material in and of itself. Like I said, there's also transportation distinctions, logistics change, right? You have some mills that are making 12-foot wide panels. You have others that are making 8-foot or narrower than 8-foot. And if you do commoditize and you design for all that, then you preclude the Europeans from being able to load containers and ship material over here competitively. That's not really an advantage to anyone, because we need to have more growth, more utilization of mass timber, as an industry, right? We need to be able to utilize the product.
If we're going out of this commoditization side of the conversation, I think one of the things that becomes really important is being able to work with a manufacturer to take advantage of what they're putting out based on their inputs, right? And so how do manufacturers, but specifically Nordic, do that? How are you working with the design and build teams to make sure that they're aware of all the different nuances and intricacies of your guys' products?
Well, we're pretty transparent. We do keep a very good library of products on our website. Not everyone wants to do the deep dive, right? So my job as the business development manager is to make that plain at the outset, is that this is designed to give you the most ability to go out and get multiple sources of supply so that you can guarantee that the project is going to advance, that your budget is sound, and that your pro forma is going to work. Now, that being said, because Nordic is sawing their own material, we may have a different cross-section that could be more efficient in terms of production or logistics. We may be able to provide an advantage that, even though everything is exactly equal, there may be an advantage on the installation side. We may have a longer panel that creates less picks, therefore feeds up the installation time. So there's things like that. And it's our job as a manufacturer and as a design assist partner, by virtue of the way we operate, to help identify those areas early on so that we can not necessarily drive the dialogue, but make people aware of it. And then when it comes time to descope and they're looking at making comparisons, they're doing it with as much information as possible, and they're making good decisions. Doesn't mean we win every project, obviously, but it's a few of the areas can be product specific that tend to distinguish Nordic overall.
It's much more than just a product. You're not just buying glulam or CLT. You're buying like all of the wraparound support that comes with it. Am I getting that right?
You're exactly right. It could go further than that. I mean, our whole premise is, our company, even though we're a manufacturer or we're vertically integrated, we're really engineering driven. We're design driven, and our leadership has always been focused on making sure that, because that leadership came from the heavy construction industry, that they know the dynamics of what motivates the GC and the client and the designer partners, right? The architect and the engineer, to try and help make an efficient structure, an efficient job site, et cetera. So when we look at projects, we're looking all the way downstream to logistics limitations, right? Site constraints. How are we going to address this? We don't just look at a set of plans and quote the material. We look at everything, because we're trying to think of how, if we get this job, how we're going to actually execute it. So I think there's layers of complexity with that, but it really helps inform the dialogue. Unfortunately, we don't always get to talk to the people that are making those decisions, because the first step is usually talking to an estimator. And what they're looking for is completely different than what, the finished product is, everyone else in upstream is looking for. They're looking for the easy answer. And sometimes we have to kind of make our pain of ourselves by asking and qualifying more deeply, right? Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But, overall, I think that people understand that we're trying to help them and advance that, the positives of the project.
Yeah, and it's such a, I'm going to use quote, it's like new industry here, like if you're looking at construction as an entire history. But there are some, so you have all the wraparound services that support getting these projects in the ground. You're working with the teams behind them, but there are some product nuances that differ from manufacturer to manufacturer. And I wanted to talk about like the species and the grade that you guys produce and how that's different than things that we might see in the US South or the US West Coast. So you mentioned black spruce. Like we have black spruce that grows in the States, but they grow in different climates, right? So just because one tree is a black spruce here and one tree is a black spruce here does not mean that they have the same characteristics. Can you unpack for me like what that means for your guys' products?
Sure, absolutely. And it's a great question. Even within Canada, like, the black spruce that grows in the areas in southern Quebec has different design values than the area that we're harvesting. So if you think of the continent as a whole, there's an east-west continental divide, right? So the Rockies water flows west to the Pacific and flows east eventually out to the Atlantic. There's a north-south continental divide that people don't talk about, and we're on the north side of that, and it has a very specific growth cycle and climate. And so you're looking at about a 50-day growing season, and that 50-day growing season means that you've got, small trees that are looking for sunlight. They don't get very, very much, so they're pushing high as much as possible, and they don't grow very, very wide. So that density is really what distinguishes the black spruce that we have. And fully 85% of the fiber that we're harvesting is mechanically stress rateable over 1950 MSR. So that's a really high value, and that's what allows us to be equivalent to Doug fir on the West Coast of 24F with a tree that grows for 500 plus years, right? I mean, you can get Doug firs that are over 1,000 years old. So here we've got a long rotation crop of 80 years where it achieves peak maturity, and we've got about a 40-year window to extract it, versus a legacy tree that can continue to encapsulate carbon over time. And every year that it does, it gets bigger, it encapsulates more and more and more. And yet we've been harvesting that to make dimension lumber. Well, here we're taking trees that people don't even think are valid, right? They typically make fencing and strips and cribbing and that kind of thing. And we're taking that fiber and extracting the best and highest use out of it. So that's the the focus and the singular vision of our company is to elevate that product. So when you get further south, you're getting a lower density spruce, and that's why at the 49th parallel, you go from SPF to SPFS. And SPFS has lower design values, so getting a 24F glulam out of that product is not going to happen. You're going to get a 20F product. So now you've got a distinction, right? You've got about a 10% delta in the fiber strength rating of those products, and that means deeper beams, wider beams for the same overall load that you're talking about. So that allows us to, basically give an equivalent dimension and cross section to a Doug fir element. And we're doing it with a product that's as light as that. So that has logistics consequences, that has screw carrying, connection detail impact, et cetera, right? So I might be able to use an 8 millimeter screw, diameter screw versus a 10 millimeter screw. And if you have 200,000 screws on a job and there's 50 cents a screw difference, well, that's a pretty significant budgetary impact, right? So little things like that can have a huge impact. And that's why just quoting a price on CLT or glulam is of no interest to us. We want to quote the package because we want it to be very clear and concise that what we're offering, you don't have to add anything else to it, right? That this is the delivered package for the core and shell. And we've got the design assist services to provide that with our backup team in our Montreal office. So.
How much or what portion of your client conversations when people are coming to you and they're saying, hey, we want to use or consider Nordic's products, how many of those conversations come out and just say, hey, just bid the CLT and glulam, or do they come to you for that whole package? How do you convey that message to people that are only shopping for the two products?
Initially, we're seeing more and more people just asking us for a price for CLT and glulam. And basically, we've been having the same conversation for 15 years. That's not the way we price. We don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to the market, and, we quote projects. And so we may have ways to gain efficiency and drive a better project price predicated on our approach and our interpretation of the way the project is going to get built. And therefore, the cost of the material is only one component and not necessarily the question that they need to be asking, right? As we've grown, as this becomes more prevalent in the industry, I think people are more prone to listen. I think they understand that Nordic's approach is a little bit different than virtually everyone else's. And if they have the patience to listen and we have the ability to inform them, then we can have a good informed dialogue. And again, it doesn't mean that they're going to go that way, right? There's always competition and there's always different nuances. There may be a motivating factor that will cause someone to go in a different direction. But the fact that we've been able to deliver thousands of projects all over North America from the West Coast Southern California, we're getting down into Orange County out of Quebec, and we're going all the way up to the Arctic Circle on some projects, and we cover down to the Gulf, and we put projects into the Caribbean. I think that indicates that there's a willingness of people to engage in that conversation, and part of it, I think, is giving them a comfort level in that, as they're, whether it's a GC or a direct client that we're working with, that we help de-risk that process, right? Because, they're not looking for, oh, this part was missed. And we're very transparent about everything that we provide, right? So it helps create an informed dialogue, and it makes them a better customer in the process. It may not get us the order, but it will definitely make sure that their needs are covered when they're talking to other people.
So you mentioned having, east to west coast coverage, Arctic Circle down to the Caribbean. There's another conversation topic in the mass timber world where it talks about, hey, if you're shipping materials across that broad of a range, how sustainable is that really? What's your response?
Great question. Well, it all depends on how you move the product and what you do with it, right? So if you're building efficient structures and you're using it to the best of your ability, first and foremost, that should be good, right? We're harvesting product from a pretty wide swath of forest land in northern Quebec, but we're transforming it, and we're providing it all the way through to the finished detailed product. Normally, if you're trying to move product across the country, if there's a supplier that's in the backyard of the project, chances are he's going to have a huge advantage freight-wise over you. Fortunately for us, we've been doing engineered wood products and dimension lumber products as part of our overall product mix for the better part of 60 plus years, right? We're a 63-year-old company. So we have a lot of logistics experience, and part of that is our ability to ship by rail. And we were the first, we really pioneered rail shipment of cross-laminated timber across the U.S. And when you do that, you talk about sustainable. I think the question is whether it's efficient and whether your fuel costs can be justified as part of a cradle to gate or cradle to cradle type scenario that we're looking at. You can actually move a ton of material 500 miles on a gallon of diesel fuel if you put it on rail, right? You can't do that by truck. So the further we go, and it becomes a question of scale, right? I can't do that for a small project, and that's one of the reasons that Nordic doesn't really focus on single-family homes or small boutique projects. We tend to look at larger projects where there is an efficiency that's gained by the scale of the project, and it may warrant the ability to be able to ship by rail. So we've done that, and we've developed relationships with transload facilities and local transporters to be able to service job sites, and that has a huge impact. So it actually helps reduce the global warming potential of the transportation. It reduces fossil fuel use, and it creates a very efficient throughput on the project.
Another part of the conversation for supplying projects all across the Western Hemisphere, or maybe North America is the appropriate term there. If you're shipping products down to SoCal or the East Coast or down to the Caribbean, like you said, somebody might, if there's a plant in somebody's backyard, they might have a logistical advantage there. But if you're supplying projects to all these different parts of the region, what does that say about the capacity for CLT production in North America? Because there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of buzz about how much capacity the industry has, whether we're going to meet or exceed it. There's lots of plants coming online. You've got European folks importing or plans to set up production facilities here. Like, what's the capacity conversation right now, and how are you guys approaching that?
It's interesting that I tend to hear from designers primarily, right? The design community, that they can't get product when they need it. And, honestly, I haven't seen a handful of projects, other than a handful of projects a year, that actually deliver on the predicated contract time that we have to deliver it. And you've only got a finite amount of production time available at a plant, right? We have 200 working days a year. We have 2 or 3 shifts. I mean, you can make X amount of panels, and go. With that being said, no one is producing spaghetti at their plant the way the industry is set up. That's what the intent is, and everyone does their what if scenario, and they talk about their potential volume predicated on at least 2 shifts of continued production. And in the 15 years that we've been doing this with CLT, and the years prior that we were doing it with glulam projects and laminated deck projects, we have not fulfilled the minimum requirement for full utilization at our plant. And it's not because we don't have the capacity. We have the capacity. The way the construction industry is set up, it's just we're victims to project slide. And when you have a construction delay, there's only so much storage that you can have at a plant. There's only so much material that you can make in advance. And there's only so much cash flow you can have if you're a fabricator to acquiring material and putting it in until you get paid, right? So if the project slips by a couple of weeks, that's not a big deal. But a project slips by 6 months or a year, and you've predicated your production time to that, all of a sudden you're out. Unless you can fill that rapidly, you've got no way of generating that cash flow, right? And I can't imagine being a fabricator that's just gotten into the industry and he's built his order file, and all of a sudden he has a major project that slides by 6 months or a year, and he can't generate enough cash flow to keep his employees on the payroll, right? Because you don't want to go to the bank and borrow at 8% interest to make payroll, right? So if the industry was able to take the product as it was being manufactured and utilized, as the intent is, and it's not malicious, it's just an economic reality, right? An order slides. And it can slide for a variety of reasons, right? It could be a project problem. It could be a financing problem. It could be any number of things, weather-related delays. But all these impacts, they have a downstream effect on the manufacturer. But I can tell you there's way more capacity in North America right now than the ability of the industry to take it on a consistent basis, right? So it should be that way. We should be ramping up, and there should be more production coming on stream, but the takeaway just doesn't exist. I mean, ideally it would, right? There's a lot of people what-ifing and throwing stuff at the dartboard and saying I could do this with X, but it just doesn't happen. I've never seen it, right? And so between North America and Europe, there's plenty of capacity, and as long as it's done sustainably, ultimately I think we're okay. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking at opportunities to put a facility in, but the guaranteed takeaway is the critical part.
Do you think that capacity conversation, whether it's coming from designers or other folks on the team, because like you said, like you're not looking for those smaller projects, right, where you can't get that efficiency of scale. Do you think that makes a use case for certain types of manufacturers, like focusing on those types of smaller projects, and certain manufacturers focusing on the big ones, and there's like 2 different markets there? Or do you see the CLT production as kind of like one holistic beast?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think if you hadn't asked the question the way you did, I would have had a completely different answer. I think, we don't necessarily look at small projects, but we have partners that are geared towards that and that have the capacity to fill our equipment and design product. And so we do have a downstream capability there, right? I'm talking, there's Nordic specific, but then there's our corporate structure with manufacturing, the partners that we engage with that can't fabricate, but that can design and utilize that. And so we do. And even with that, that's the point. Even with that, those guys are providing the smaller scale, higher level of detail, architecturally demanding projects that maybe don't scale up to the effect when you're looking at an office building or a large academic structure. And so that is a positive. It may very well be that if there's a community scale manufacturer that has a local resource and a guaranteed takeaway for residential housing, for instance, and it could be small scale, it could be cabins, it could be small scale multi-res. There's a huge demand for workforce housing, And it definitely would make a lot of sense for that. Question is, does it go to new manufacturing, or does it go to someone who's going to do the design work and allow the manufacturers to extract that throughput and make the spaghetti and get it out to the market, right? I think that's a really appropriate question, and we need to look at that.
Well, that's a thoughtful answer. And so I have a follow-up for you on those different types of projects that are being, from large to small and different office versus multifamily, et cetera. Do you think that there is a typology, a use, a size that we should be focusing more on and promoting more mass timber use in? And I ask that question because everybody talks about taller. We're going 18 to 21 to, there's hybrid towers that are going double that, across the world. Where do you think that we should be focusing for mass timber right now?
I love that question. Where have you been the past 10 years?
High school.
No, I'm serious. This is something I remember being in New York and talking with the lead engineer of their mass timber division, Michelle Rolos. I don't know if you know her.
I know the name. I don't know her personally.
So Michelle's she's great, very thoughtful. We had the opportunity to just engage on a project. I don't think we ever actually delivered a project together, but we were asked to speak at an event, and she came out and said something that just, it warmed my heart, because it was exactly the way I feel. We have the ability technically to build as tall as we want. And other than a monument to our own hubris, I don't think that really necessarily achieves end goals, because it really does create more of a unique boutique type approach. And it's not necessarily to the best interests of the industry at large, or does it properly respond to the need for us to draw carbon down at scale. That being said, workforce housing, which I mentioned before, especially in the urban milieu, is really, really important, and it's one of my passions. And the ability to build a good quality structural product that can be used and is efficient and has replicability in the urban setting should allow for urban workers to actually live in the cities that they work in. It should be affordable. It is scalable. Susan Jones and the Heartwood Project up in Seattle is a perfect example. It's a dream of mine to work with Susan at some point and actually deliver one of those. We're very friendly. I've known her since before she built her house, and she's a very visionary person. Our director of technical services served with her also on the Tallwood Building Committee. So there's kind of a mutual path towards helping develop the code. And while it's great to be able to build tall, if you look at the utilization in any urban setting, the amount of buildings that are over 6 stories, percentage-wise, is very small. So taking that and using wood in those applications, I think it's not wasteful, but it's not as fruitful as if you're going to go hit the 80-20 rule. If you look at the 5 boroughs in New York City, there's over 1 million buildings. And of those 1 million buildings, only 17,000 are taller than 6 stories. So percentage-wise, if you think of what can we do across the landscape of the world, actually, because they're talking like there's going to be a new New York City built in the third world countries every year or two, right? So there's this huge movement towards the cities. We're going to need affordable housing, and I think that good design and utilization of that fiber can actually serve both purposes, right? It's going to give people a good place to live. It's going to be safe. It's going to have much longer durability than the 5/1 light frame projects that are being built, and it's also going to help offset the issue that we were talking about with needing more capacity. The ability for the manufacturers to actually produce on a consistent basis and achieve efficiency and be viable is really critical, right? We can't afford any more losses in the industry. We don't need more manufacturers going down because they can't make payroll. That's a real travesty. So
yes, it is. And to unpack your question specifically in like the multifamily, and we'll use that 5/1 example. I've been talking to a lot of multifamily developers lately who aren't necessarily like deep in the mass timber industry. Maybe they heard about it, but when I talk to them about it, the number one response right off the bat is no way, it's cost competitive. There's no way that I can build this 5/1 close to par with mass timber. Like, what would be your response to that?
I'd say they're probably just adhering to the way the code is written, and not distinguishing the true overall cost of ownership. If they're a developer flipper, maybe they're right. If they're a developer that's going to hold on to it, or a client that's going to hold on to it for a while, there's definitely an argument for the sustainable nature and the quality of construction that you're going to get from that. Secondly, I do believe that if you're building with mass timber, not just the efficiency of the structure from a structural standpoint, but also the impact on the quality of life and just the mechanical loads of a mass timber structure versus a 5/1, which tend to be leaky. They're not efficient. I mean, you can go on and on about why that does or doesn't pencil out, but I think that argument doesn't really hold a lot of water. I think it's a very short-term cost analysis, and it may be that it's just predicated on them wanting to take that, build it, and flip it. Right? If you're going to be a long-term holder of the project, just the maintenance of that project over time is going to dictate that it's much more efficient to build with mass timber.
So, with the exception of California and maybe a few other cities in the States, on the pricing factor, carbon isn't in the equation. How do you see carbon pricing moving forward factoring into the mass timber industry? Like when people are being allocated, hey, you got so much embodied carbon or operational emissions, combine those up however you want, you're only allowed this much, you got to pay for anything excess of it. How do you see that playing into mass timber's growth over the next decade or so?
It's obviously becoming more and more important. For me, it's always been part of my pursuit, right? The reason I'm doing this is I want to capture carbon at scale. I want to, put carbon into buildings instead of putting it into the air. And I think that speaks to a lot of the people that have come on board at Nordic, right? It tends to be a common thread that unites us. So for me, if we were talking just, conventional construction, you're finding more and more people that are talking about the 2030 agenda. I wonder where they've been for the past 20 years, because it's not new, right? We've been talking about carbon for a long, long time. And yeah, there's no atheists in a foxhole, right? So we're getting closer to that. Everyone wants to jump in and say we're doing our bit and so on. What I'm finding now is that we're seeing non-traditional uses for mass timber start to become really impactful in terms of volume because of the carbon question. And if you look at it strictly from a pro forma standpoint, it does not pencil out, right? Tilt-up walls, warehouses, data centers, that kind of thing. You would never hear them talking about that 5 years ago. And now those kind of conversations are coming in, and people really want to draw carbon down, and they want to be carbon neutral. So that is having a huge impact. And we're seeing more and more of that as things progress, right? 2 years ago, maybe 1 out of 100 projects, we would hear that. And now it's like virtually every project that's either academic or industrial, believe it or not, are coming across, and that's the big metric. That's what they want to do. And so with that, there's, you talked about commoditization, that the whole distinction of how much carbon you're capturing. Wood is 50% carbon by dry weight. We all know that. So it's pretty easy to do that calculation. But then the other side of the coin is the production costs and the true greenhouse gas impacts and the global warming potential of the manufacturing, right? So I think that's going to become the next part of the equation. Carbon itself is one. Efficiency of production and the through process all the way through to the install are going to be part of the next dialogue.
Who are you following right now that you think has the right dialogue about either carbon or mass timber? Like, who do you think more people should be paying attention to?
I just think that a lot of the people that got me involved in mass timber that were kind of my leads early on are still the people that I listen to. I think they were right to begin with, and they continue to be right. And they just maybe wisdom comes from repetitiveness and exposure. Andrew Waugh, big part of the reason that I love mass timber. Susan Jones, Alan Organsky out of New Haven. He's been a tremendous mentor to me. Got me involved in the first net zero project in Connecticut. It was a school that they built for underprivileged kids. So there's the social mandate as well as the mass timber mandate. And I think the more I go, I find myself leaning more towards the people that are geared not just to utilization of mass timber, but the social impact and the social governance and the equality that mass timber can bring. So I'm leaning more towards those type of projects, right? The underserved, the underprivileged, those that actually need to be living in good housing and that can't necessarily afford to move into the ones that they'd like to. And so Susan Jones's Hardwood, for instance, Michael Eliason up in Seattle. I think he's really a great overall architect with vision for design. There's more, but I think those people kind of bring it to the table.
Yeah, those are good answers, and I think those are all great people for everybody listening to connect with, learn about.
I hesitate to start making lists because I end up forgetting a bunch of people that are really important to me, and I want to apologize ahead of time. There's definitely not an intent here to mislead, because there are some really tremendous people out there that are doing great work.
Yeah, and I think if we were
I apologize if I didn't mention it.
Well, if we were to sit here and make a list of all the people doing good work, that would just be the whole podcast, right?
Well, it would be a lot longer podcast for sure.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yep.
Knowing the path that you just kind of laid out, what you're focused on, what's next for you and what's next for Nordic in like the next 5 to 10 years? Nordic
is going to continue to try and reduce its carbon footprint more and more, right? Over the past 10 years, we have grown from a single sawmill manufacturing I-joists and glulam and dimensional lumber to 2 sawmills, then to 2 sawmills and a pulp plant. Recently, we acquired 2 new sawmills, so we're now up to 16 million acres of forest land that we harvest through FSC practices. So there's that, right? We want to continue to make impact at scale with good social governance, good sustainability attributes, making sure that we're being a good supporter of the local communities. And so with that, for instance, we just engaged with the local Cree community to modernize and bring back a sawmill on their land, so that they can become part help control the utilization of their resources, and we're helping them bring that to market. The next steps are going to be continued global warming potential reduction through our operations, more efficiency there. We've looked at electric vehicles on our forestry operations, and right now that's not viable, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to keep our ear to the ground on that. Interestingly enough, recently we just there was just a post on LinkedIn, not sure if you saw it, but we've signed an agreement with a European company that is looking at forestry extraction by a blip. So this is totally new, and it's something. It's going to be a long-term process. I think maybe 4 or 5 years before we can actually do prototypical extraction. But that's going to be a huge impact, because right now, even though we're 95% renewable energy driven at our plant, if we have the ability to reduce our fossil fuel use by another 4 or 5%, by doing better extraction and more efficient extraction, that's a nice goal to have.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a leadership role for us within the community, and of course we're harvesting on a pretty wide swath of area, right? We're We're not like a fabricator, and because we're vertically integrated, that's something that's really key to us. And hopefully that will continue to spark innovation for the bigger industry.
Yeah, especially if you have such a large footprint, those small incremental changes or towards the positive have a very large effect, right? When people hear, oh, if we can reduce something 4 or 5%, doesn't sound like that, but you're like, well, we're doing that across 16 million acres of harvesting. Like all of a sudden that becomes a bigger number.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
Those are all great things, and I'm looking forward to watching all of that unfold. Before I ask my last question, how can people get a hold of you and Nordic?
I'm real easy to get a hold of. My phone's on our website. It's my email address is Jean-Marc Dubois @nordic.ca. The Nordic website is nordic.ca. It's pretty quick and dirty to get to. And we're available. I've got a really amazing team of coworkers, colleagues, specialists that I engage with. We have 80 designers, engineers, architects, and technicians at our main office in Montreal that are dedicated to this kind of service. So, feel free to reach out. Email is probably the best. You can find me on LinkedIn, look to connect, and we can always exchange information that way.
Well, I'll link all that down below. Everybody can check it out and get a hold of you. Last question.
Sweet.
If you had the power to change anything in the industry, what would it be and why?
Anything at all, huh?
Anything in the industry.
Anything in the industry. And we're not talking forest products industry. We're talking mass timber at large.
Mass timber at large.
Well, if I had a magic wand and I could change anything, the one thing I would address is project slippage, right? I know I'm harping on it, but it is really impactful to everyone in the industry. I remember talking to a manufacturer out west that I've developed a pretty nice relationship with over, you go to conventions, you go to the mass timber events, and you meet the same people, and it's a great community. But he told me, he said, Jean-Marc, if I would have known that it would take me 18 to 24 months after getting qualified to be able to actually get product to a job site, I don't know that I would have made the investment. And this is someone who's very well respected in the industry. And I think that, if the industry had the ability to support itself in a proper fashion, there's way more potential business than any one company can get, right? We don't want it all. We want the jobs that are right for us. And I think everyone else that we deal with or that we compete with in the industry is exactly the same. So finding the right fit, I think, is important. But making sure that we have the longevity and we have the long-term viability of the business is critical. And so for me, that's really what I would like to see. And that would address all the issues that the industry is talking about, the commoditization, the standardization, right? I mean, if you find the right supplier and you've got the right time frame and you're committed and you have the ability to take that project, that's a good fit, right? And we need more successful business. There's a huge opportunity for everyone in the industry, and we just can't afford any more losses. So go out and design a good structure, and you'll find a good supplier, and let's make it happen. Let's draw carbon down at scale.
Another great answer. I love it. Well, thanks for chatting with me. It was a pleasure talking with you, and like I said, I look forward to watching what you guys do over the next decade. Thanks for coming on.
Yep. All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.